Earlier this week, Canada announced that it had signed a defence and security partnership with the EU, just over a month after the UK signed its own defence pact with the bloc. But Canada and the UK were only the latest of a series of countries to have signed defence deals with the EU since 2024. Moldova, Norway, Japan, South Korea, Albania, and North Macedonia all have signed bespoke partnerships with the EU in the last 13 months. And this month, Australia and the Philippines also agreed to start talks on defence and security with the EU. This is all happening amid conversations about the future of NATO, the West's foremost military alliance, given US President Donald Trump's fluctuating stance on its Article 5 mutual defense clause. Having said at this week's NATO summit that the US is both with them all the way, but also that the US's commitment to Article 5 depends on your definition. So in this video, we'll take a look at the EU's historic defence policy, its network of defence pacts, and whether it could conceivably be creating an alternative to NATO. Explore which world leaders are winning and which are losing every week with our podcast, The World Leader Leaderboard. Find it on the TLDR Podcast YouTube channel or in your favourite podcast app. Let's start by outlining the EU's historic defence policy. For decades, from the establishment of NATO in 1949 until the 1992 Maastricht Treaty, which introduced the EU's common foreign and security policy, including, quote, the eventual framing of a common defence policy, which might in time lead to a common defence, the EU's defence policy was wholly integrated into the transatlantic security framework of NATO. This was because, after the Second World War and throughout the Cold War, European security against the Soviet Union could only be guaranteed by the US. NATO's Article 5 collective defence clause ensured that an attack against one member would be considered an attack against all. And while this American security guarantee has underpinned Europe's defence for decades, it simultaneously prevented the EU from establishing more efficient internal structures for things like pooling and sharing military resources, buying arms, and operational coordination. For instance, under the EU's 2002 Berlin Plus agreement, intended to improve the EU's access to NATO planning capabilities and avoid the duplication of NATO structures, any use of NATO assets by the EU requires unanimity among NATO member states, giving non-EU countries like the US or Turkey huge veto power. This again highlights the EU's dependence on NATO, subordinating the EU's strategic interests to those of the US. Anyway, this conundrum has become more apparent over the past decade, as Europe's defence has faced several challenges, including Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, the UK's exit from the EU, and 2 Trump presidencies in the US. So in March 2022, just a few weeks after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the EU adopted its Strategic Compass, a rapidly assembled action plan to strengthen the EU's defence by 2030 and make it capable of acting decisively. This included an agreement to develop more tailored bilateral partnerships with like-minded countries and strategic partners, such as the US, Canada, Norway, the UK, Japan, and others, leading to a series of new defence and security partnerships with non-EU countries. So in May 2024, the EU signed its first 2 bilateral security partnerships, with Moldova, an EU candidate country since June 2022 that's been subject to Russian hybrid warfare, including cyber attacks and election interference, and Norway, a NATO member and the closest partner to the EU under the European Economic Area, whose defence pact focused on maritime security and protecting undersea infrastructure. Also, in November 2024, the EU signed defence deals with the Balkan countries of Albania and North Macedonia, which have aligned more closely with the EU against Russia. Beyond that though, the EU has also signed defence pacts with non-European countries, including Japan and South Korea in November, which face rising threats from China, Russia and North Korea, as well as the UK this May, which has aligned with the EU since changing government in 2024. And most recently with Canada, which Trump threatened to annex as the US's 51st state. Talks are also underway with Australia and the Philippines, 2 nations in the Indo-Pacific concerned about China's military buildup. But why is the EU actually pursuing these deals? And could the EU's network of military alliances actually work as a NATO alternative? On the first question, there are at least 3 reasons why the EU is currently expanding its network of defence pacts. First is Trump's erratic foreign policy and hostile attitude towards NATO. Since becoming president, Trump has threatened NATO allies Canada and Greenland with military action, taken an ambivalent or even pro-Russian stance on Ukraine, and repeatedly sparked alarm in Europe by suggesting that the US's commitment to NATO is conditional on defense spending, with NATO members this week agreeing to massively increase their annual defense spending to 5% of GDP, as demanded by Trump. Some analysts are now recommending that the EU prepare for the worst-case scenario, a US withdrawal from NATO, which is why the EU is now taking steps to increase its independence from NATO, both through more external defence pacts and improving its own continental defence industry. For instance, the EU recently announced an ambitious €150 billion Security Action for Europe instrument, including funds for common procurement projects, and is also working on the European Industrial Defence Programme, aimed at integrating supply chains, facilitating cross-border cooperation, and increasing defence manufacturing capability. But any European-led NATO alternative would require years or even decades to build up the structures and operational capacities of NATO. So EU members will want to keep the US firmly on side for as long as possible. Anyway, the second reason for this network of defense pacts is Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has brought the military threat right to Europe's doorstep. Germany's defense chief Carsten Breuer and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky have both recently suggested that Russia could attack NATO within 5 years, and the EU definitely wouldn't want to see the US's commitment to Article 5 tested in this way. As such, its defence pacts with non-EU countries like Canada, Norway and the UK give the EU more options for procurement in the event of a conflict. The third reason is broader geopolitical shifts. The world looks totally different now compared to after World War II, when NATO was found, with a multipolar order marked by military superpowers like Russia, China and the US, and new hybrid warfare tactics including cyber threats, disinformation, maritime attacks, and even space vulnerabilities. The EU's defence pacts with Japan, South Korea, the UK and Canada aim to tackle these issues and uphold global stability, which again was a role previously played by NATO. However, whether this network of security and defence partnerships could actually work as a NATO alternative is a tricky question. In its 2022 Strategic Compass, the EU stated that a stronger and more defence-capable EU would be complementary to NATO, and argued that a stronger EU and a stronger NATO are mutually reinforcing. But in recent months, the EU seems to have pivoted away from this idea towards more active efforts to improve its own collective defence, previously guaranteed by NATO. To this end, we're also seeing more coordinated defence efforts from the E3 group of France, Germany and the UK, which could potentially drive a European-led NATO if required in the future. Now, when talking about topics like these, it's important to be precise, and precision is also crucial to our sponsor this week, Henson Shaving. Henson's AL13 razor, which they produce at their aerospace machine shop, perfectly holds blades at a 30-degree angle and extends them only 0.0013 inches, less than the width of a human hair, which means incredibly tight tolerances, very high standards, and superb precision, offering a much healthier shave compared to the overpriced plastic razor cartridges. And speaking of plastic, Henson's razors are completely plastic-free. From the blade to the box, everything Henson sends you is entirely recyclable, meaning that while you protect your skin from expensive razor burn, you're also protecting the environment from adding to the 2 billion razor cartridges that are thrown away every year in the US alone. Finally, buying Henson razors is simply cheaper. No longer will you be forced into buying those expensive and unsupportive replacement blades, as Henson blades cost about 10 cents each. This means that you can replace your blades far more frequently, so you don't need to keep dragging a dull razor across your face in order to get value out of that overpriced plastic. If you want to try it out, then you can go to hensonshaving.com/TLDR or click the link in the description. And then you can add a razor and 100 blades to your cart. Once you've done that, add discount code TLDR at checkout and you'll get all of those blades totally free. And you'll be on the way to a healthier shave.